December 7, 1941. The dawn broke over Pearl Harbor with fire and fury, but beneath the surface of the Pacific Ocean, a different kind of war was already stirring. While Japanese bombers turned American battleships into floating pyres, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto stood on the bridge of the flagship Nagato, his face betraying none of the triumph his subordinates expected. He stared at the decoded intelligence reports spread before him, reports that spoke of 51 American submarines scattered across the Pacific Fleet's roster. His fingers traced the paper's edge as he muttered words that would haunt the Imperial Japanese Navy for the next 4 years. "I fear we have awakened a sleeping dragon whose teeth are hidden beneath the waves." The submarines Yamamoto feared were not the gleaming weapons of propaganda posters. They were diesel-electric predators like the USS Gato, USS Wahoo, and USS Tong, vessels that measured over 300 feet in length and displaced 1,500 tons when submerged. Each carried 24 torpedoes in their tubes and magazines, enough firepower to cripple a convoy or sink a carrier. But in those early weeks after Pearl Harbor, these submarines were plagued by a catastrophic flaw that would cost American submariners dearly and give Japanese naval commanders false confidence in their anti-submarine defenses. Commander Dudley Morton paced the cramped control room of USS Wahoo somewhere in the East China Sea during January 1943, his jaw clenched tight enough to crack teeth. He had just watched through the periscope as his perfectly aimed torpedo struck the hull of a Japanese freighter at precisely 90 degrees, the ideal angle for maximum damage. The crew held their breath, counting seconds until the explosion. But instead of the satisfying boom of detonation, they heard only the metallic clang of the Mark 14 torpedo bouncing harmlessly off the enemy's hull like a rubber ball against concrete. Morton slammed his fist against the periscope housing, his third failed attack in as many days. The Mark 14 torpedo, America's primary submarine weapon, suffered from defects so severe they bordered on sabotage. According to naval historian Clay Blair's research documented in Silent Victory, the U.S. submarine war against Japan, the Bureau of Ordnance had failed to properly test these weapons before war broke out, relying instead on mathematical calculations and limited trials that never revealed the truth. The magnetic exploders detonated too early or not at all. The contact exploders crumpled on impact instead of triggering. The torpedoes ran 10 feet deeper than their set depth. These three flaws, working in deadly combination, meant that even when American submarines achieved perfect attack positions, their weapons betrayed them. Japanese merchant captain Takeshi Yamamoto, no relation to the admiral, commanded the freighter Ryusei Maru as it steamed through the Luzon Strait in February 1943. He had survived 2 submarine attacks in the past month, both times watching American torpedoes pass beneath his ship's keel or fail to explode upon contact. Standing on his bridge wing, he shared sake with his first officer and laughed about the incompetent Americans, whose submarines posed little real threat. Japanese naval intelligence had documented these American torpedo failures, and convoy commanders grew increasingly confident that their merchant vessels could survive the crossing from the Philippines to the home islands. This confidence, built on the temporary shield of American mechanical failure, would prove catastrophically misplaced once American submariners solved their torpedo crisis. March 5-10, 1943, the submarine tender USS Sperry rocked gently at anchor in Pearl Harbor's protected waters while below decks. A revolution in naval warfare was taking shape. Lieutenant Commander Lawson Patterson Ramage hunched over a workbench surrounded by disassembled Mark 14 torpedoes, their components spread across oil-stained canvas like the organs of mechanical beasts awaiting resurrection. Ramage commanded USS Trout, and like every submarine captain in the Pacific Fleet, he had grown sick of watching his attacks fail due to defective weapons. The Navy's Bureau of Ordnance insisted the torpedoes worked perfectly, blaming misses on poor seamanship or incorrect attack procedures. But the submarine force knew better, and they were prepared to fix the problem themselves, regulations be damned. Ramage's fingers moved with surgical precision as he examined the torpedo's magnetic exploder, a complex mechanism designed to detonate the warhead when it detected the magnetic field of a ship's steel hull. In theory, this allowed torpedoes to explode beneath a target's keel, breaking its back with the force of the blast. In practice, the Earth's magnetic field varied wildly across the Pacific, causing exploders to detonate prematurely or not at all. Commander Charles Lockwood, the submarine force commander for the Pacific Fleet, had authorized what amounted to field modifications that would make Bureau of Ordnance admirals apoplectic with rage. Submariners began physically removing the magnetic exploders from their torpedoes, relying instead solely on contact detonation. The USS Wahoo departed Pearl Harbor on her third war patrol in late January 1943, with all magnetic exploders disconnected, a decision that Commander Morton made with full knowledge he was violating official policy. His executive officer, Lieutenant Richard O'Kane, plotted their course toward the Japanese-held waters around New Guinea, where intelligence suggested heavy convoy traffic. O'Kane would later become one of America's most decorated submarine commanders, but in early 1943 he was still learning the deadly calculus of undersea warfare. The two men stood together on Wahoo's bridge as the submarine passed through Pearl Harbor's submarine nets, neither speaking the thought both shared: would removing the magnetic exploders be enough, or were there still undiscovered flaws waiting to betray them? Japanese Rear Admiral Terahisa Komatsu reviewed convoy protection reports at his headquarters in Rabaul during early March 1943, and a troubling pattern emerged from the data. Several merchant captains reported that American torpedoes seemed to be malfunctioning less frequently. The Nikkei Maru had taken a torpedo amidships that exploded with devastating effect, sending her to the bottom in less than 4 minutes. The Nitsu Maru suffered similar fate 3 days later. Komatsu ordered his intelligence officers to investigate whether the Americans had finally corrected their torpedo problems, but the bureaucratic machinery of the Imperial Japanese Navy moved slowly, and by the time his inquiry reached Tokyo, events in the Pacific had already rendered the question moot. Commander Dudley Morton brought USS Wahoo into the shallow waters of Wuk Harbor on the northern coast of New Guinea during the moonless night of January 26, 1943, executing one of the most audacious submarine attacks of the war. The harbor was crowded with Japanese transports and destroyers, their hulls silhouetted against the shore lights that enemy commanders carelessly left burning. Morton conned his submarine through the anchored ships like a wolf among sheep, firing torpedoes at point-blank range from distances so close his crew could hear Japanese sailors shouting on deck. This time, freed from the burden of faulty magnetic exploders, the torpedoes ran true and struck hard. Explosions rippled across the harbor as 4 Japanese ships erupted in flames, their cargoes of fuel and ammunition cooking off in secondary blasts that lit the tropical night brighter than day. O'Kane stood at the periscope calling out targets while Morton maneuvered the submarine with a fighter pilot's instinct for three-dimensional combat. They sank the destroyer Harusami, the freighter Fukui Maru, and damaged 2 transport ships before Japanese shore batteries finally began returning fire. Wahoo crash-dived beneath the harbor's murky waters as depth charges began exploding overhead, but Morton had already calculated his escape route through a channel he had scouted during daylight reconnaissance. The submarine scraped bottom twice as she crept out of Wuk Harbor, her hull groaning under the pressure, but she emerged into deep water with her crew intact and her torpedo tubes empty. News of Morton's success spread through the submarine force like wildfire, proof that aggressive tactics combined with functioning weapons could devastate Japanese shipping. June 3, 1943. 3 American submarines converged on a point in the Pacific Ocean 200 miles east of Formosa, their radio masts breaking the surface just long enough to exchange coded messages before disappearing back beneath the waves. USS Zero, USS Shad, and USS Grayback had been ordered to operate as a coordinated hunting group, the first American attempt to replicate the German U-boat Wolfpack tactics that had proven so effective in the Atlantic. Commander David White aboard Zero functioned as the pack commander, coordinating attacks and sharing target information with his companion submarines through encrypted burst transmissions that lasted only seconds, too brief for Japanese direction finding equipment to locate accurately. The concept of submarine wolfpacks challenged traditional American naval doctrine, which had always emphasized individual ship operations and captain's initiative. Admiral Charles Lockwood, recently promoted to Commander Submarine Force Pacific, had studied German Kriegsmarine methods and recognized their potential application against Japanese merchant shipping. But American submarines operated across vastly greater distances than their German counterparts in the Atlantic, and the Pacific Fleet's submarines were designed for independent long-range patrols rather than coordinated pack operations. Lockwood's staff worked through the technical and tactical problems of submarine group coordination throughout early 1943, developing new radio procedures and attack protocols that would allow multiple submarines to assault the same convoy without sinking each other in the confusion of night surface attacks. Japanese convoy commander Captain Hiroshi Tokumaru stood on the bridge of the destroyer Uranami as it escorted 15 merchantmen northward, from Manila to Yokohama in mid-June 1943. His convoy followed the standard Japanese anti-submarine doctrine, destroyers and patrol vessels, arrayed around the merchant ships in a protective screen, zigzagging at irregular intervals to complicate submarine attack calculations, maintaining radio silence to avoid revealing their position. Tokumaru had escorted 17 convoys through these waters without losing a single ship to submarine attack, a record that earned him commendation from the Naval General Staff. His confidence was rooted in the apparent continuing unreliability of American torpedoes and the effectiveness of Japanese depth charge attacks that had forced several American submarines to break off their approaches. Commander White aboard USS Zero detected Tokumaru's convoy through his radar set, the newly installed technology that gave American submarines an overwhelming advantage in night surface operations. The radar painted a clear picture of 15 large contacts escorted by 4 smaller vessels, exactly the kind of target that Wolfpack tactics were designed to devastate. White transmitted the contact report to Shad and Grayback using the new burst transmission equipment, then began tracking the convoy while his companion submarines raced to intercept positions. The 3 submarines coordinated their approach to attack simultaneously from different directions, dividing the escort screen's attention and creating multiple threats that no destroyer commander could adequately defend against. The attack began at 2300 hours with USS Grayback's torpedoes slamming into a large tanker on the convoy's starboard flank. Commander John Moore had positioned his submarine on the surface 4,000 yards from the convoy, invisible in the moonless darkness despite being theoretically within visual range of Japanese lookouts. His first spread of 4 torpedoes caught the tanker perfectly amidships, rupturing fuel tanks that erupted in towering pillars of flame bright enough to read a newspaper by. While the destroyer Uranami turned toward Grayback's position, Commander White attacked from the opposite side of the convoy, his 6 torpedoes finding 3 separate targets. 2 freighters and a troop transport took fatal damage in the space of 90 seconds, their hulls torn open by explosions that sent 1,000-ton vessels settling into the Pacific's depths. Captain Tokumaru watched in mounting horror as his carefully organized convoy disintegrated into chaos. Merchant ships scattered in all directions, breaking formation in panic as more torpedoes streaked through the darkness from seemingly impossible angles. His destroyers fired star shells and depth charges wildly, but the American submarines operated on the surface where depth charges were useless, and their low profiles made them nearly invisible even when illuminated by flares. USS Shad contributed the final blows, her torpedoes catching 2 fleeing freighters that had separated from the main body. By dawn, 9 of the convoy's 15 merchants rested on the ocean floor along with several thousand tons of rubber, rice, and raw materials destined for Japanese factories. Tokumaru's destroyer fished survivors from the oily water while his radio operator transmitted the grim casualty reports to Manila headquarters. According to naval records documented in the book Thunder Below by Eugene Fluckey, Wolfpack tactics would account for increasing percentages of Japanese shipping losses as the war progressed. September 21, 1943, the USS Harder slipped through the Luzon Strait, running submerged on battery power while her crew tested a weapon that promised to revolutionize American submarine warfare. Commander Samuel Dealey stood beside his executive officer in the control room, watching as torpedomen loaded a Mark 18 torpedo into Tube 3. Unlike the temperamental Mark 14 that had plagued submarine operations for nearly 2 years, the Mark 18 used electric propulsion instead of steam turbines, leaving no telltale wake of bubbles for enemy lookouts to spot. The torpedo was slower than its steam-powered predecessor, managing only 29 knots compared to the Mark 14's 46, but it was also far more reliable and gave American submarines a truly stealthy weapon for the first time in the war. The electric torpedo technology came from an unexpected source: captured German U-boats that the British had shared with American naval intelligence. German submariners had used electric torpedoes throughout the war with considerable success, and American engineers adapted the design for Pacific operations. The Mark 18 solved multiple problems simultaneously. Its electric motor eliminated the depth control issues that had plagued steam torpedoes. It left no visible wake for enemy ships to spot and evade, and its simpler firing mechanism proved far more reliable than the complex exploders of the Mark 14. By September 1943, submarines began receiving mixed loadouts of both torpedo types, giving commanders options for different tactical situations. Commander Dealey brought USS Harder to periscope depth as his sound operator reported propeller contacts bearing 045 degrees. Through the periscope lens, Dealey observed a Japanese destroyer conducting anti-submarine patrol in a regular search pattern, its bow wave bright white against the dark Pacific waters. Standard procedure dictated that submarines avoid destroyers when possible, as these well-armed warships were specifically designed to kill submarines and posed enormous danger in any engagement. But Dealey had orders to test the new electric torpedoes under combat conditions, and a destroyer made an ideal target for evaluating the weapon's stealth characteristics. He ordered his torpedomen to load Mark 18 weapons in tubes 1 through 4 while he calculated the destroyer's course and speed. Japanese destroyer Captain Lieutenant Commander Tomoichi Hara commanded the Ikazuchi as she patrolled the approaches to Manila Bay during late September 1943. Hara was a veteran of the Solomon Islands campaign and the Battle of the Java Sea, having survived multiple surface engagements that claimed many of his academy classmates. His destroyer specialized in anti-submarine warfare, equipped with the latest sonar equipment and an experienced crew trained to detect and destroy American submarines before they could attack. Hara maintained constant vigilance during patrol operations, personally training his lookouts to spot the characteristic white wake of approaching torpedoes that would give his ship precious seconds to maneuver and evade. This morning seemed no different from dozens of previous patrols, the sea empty of contacts and his sonar operator reporting nothing but distant whale songs and thermal layers. The first indication Hara had of USS Harder's presence came when a violent explosion lifted Ikazuchi's stern completely out of the water, breaking the destroyer's keel and flooding her engineering spaces within seconds. There had been no torpedo wake, no warning whatsoever, before the warhead struck home. Hara ordered abandoned ship even as the second torpedo caught Ikazuchi amidships, ensuring her destruction. The destroyer sank in less than 3 minutes, taking most of her crew with her. Hara found himself floating in the Philippine Sea wearing only his life jacket, surrounded by a handful of survivors who stared at him with questions he could not answer. How had an American submarine gotten within torpedo range without his sonar detecting it? Why had his lookouts seen no torpedo wakes? The invisible nature of the attack suggested some new American weapon, but Hara would not learn the truth until after the war ended. Commander Dealey watched through his periscope as the Japanese destroyer broke apart and sank, her propellers still spinning as she went down bow first. His Mark 18 torpedoes had performed flawlessly, covering the 2,500 yards to target completely invisible to enemy lookouts. Dealey reported the successful test results to Pearl Harbor via encrypted radio transmission, noting the electric torpedo's reliability and stealth characteristics exceeded expectations. Within weeks, submarine tender crews were reconfiguring torpedo rooms across the Pacific Fleet to accommodate increased loads of Mark 18 weapons. The electric torpedo gave American submarines the ability to attack destroyer escorts with reasonable chance of success, fundamentally changing the tactical balance in the Pacific submarine campaign. June 19, 1944, the Philippine Sea became an arena for the greatest carrier battle in naval history. But beneath the waves where aircraft could not venture, American submarines were already writing their part of the story. Commander Herman Kostler positioned USS Kavala 30 miles ahead of the Japanese mobile fleet's estimated track, his submarine serving as one of 12 boats deployed in scouting positions across a 400-mile front. The submarine force had evolved dramatically since the dark days of 1942, now functioning as integral components of fleet operations rather than independent raiders. Kostler's orders were straightforward: locate the Japanese carrier force, report their position, and attack any targets of opportunity that presented themselves. The Japanese mobile fleet under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa represented the Imperial Navy's last concentrated carrier striking force, 9 aircraft carriers escorted by battleships and cruisers steaming toward the Marianas to contest the American invasion of Saipan. Admiral Ozawa believed his longer-ranged aircraft gave him decisive advantage over the American carriers, allowing his planes to strike American ships while remaining beyond the range of counterattack. His staff planned an aerial decisive battle that would cripple American naval power in the Pacific and potentially turn the tide of the war. But Ozawa's operational planning contained a fatal flaw. He had not accounted for the omnipresent threat of American submarines that now controlled large sections of the Western Pacific. Commander Kostler detected Ozawa's fleet through Kavala's radar shortly after dawn on June 19th. The distinctive pattern of multiple large contacts surrounded by escorts unmistakably indicating a major fleet formation. He transmitted a contact report to Admiral Raymond Spruance, commanding the Fifth Fleet, then began tracking the Japanese carriers while maintaining a position ahead of their line of advance. Kostler identified the largest carrier in the formation as either Shikaku or Zuikaku, veteran carriers that had participated in the Pearl Harbor attack and survived multiple major engagements throughout the Pacific War. He maneuvered Kavala into attack position while Japanese aircraft launched from the carrier's flight decks, beginning the airstrikes that American pilots would later mockingly name the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Shikaku had just recovered aircraft from the first strike wave when Kostler fired a 6-torpedo spread from 3,000 yards range, the electric motors of his Mark 18 torpedoes driving them silently through the Philippine Sea's warm waters. 3 torpedoes struck Shikaku's starboard side in quick succession, rupturing fuel tanks and starting fires that quickly spread through the carrier's hangar deck. Japanese damage control parties fought desperately to contain the blazes, but aviation gasoline and armed aircraft created an environment where one spark could trigger catastrophic secondary explosions. Commander Kostler took Kavala deep as Japanese destroyers counterattacked with depth charges, but he could hear through his hull the muffled booms of internal explosions tearing Shikaku apart from within. The carrier Shikaku sank at approximately noon on June 19, 1944, taking with her veteran aircrew who had fought since the war's opening days and carrying to the bottom the mystique of Japanese carrier invincibility. Admiral Ozawa watched from his flagship Zuikaku as one of his most valuable units disappeared beneath the waves, victim of an enemy he could not effectively counter. American submarines could approach fleet formations submerged, strike without warning, and escape before surface escorts could respond effectively. The loss of Shikaku, combined with the catastrophic failure of Ozawa's airstrikes, which lost over 300 aircraft for minimal American losses, marked the effective end of Japanese carrier aviation as a strategic force. According to historical analysis by Samuel Eliot Morison in History of United States Naval Operations in World War II, the submarine contribution to the Battle of the Philippine Sea proved as decisive as the aerial combat that captured newspaper headlines. 3 hours after Shikaku's sinking, USS Albacore, commanded by Lieutenant Commander James Blanchard, detected another section of Ozawa's fleet and maneuvered into attack position on the carrier Taiho, Admiral Ozawa's flagship and the newest, most modern carrier in the Japanese fleet. Blanchard fired a 6-torpedo spread at the massive carrier from 4,500 yards, a long shot by submarine standards, but justified by the target's importance. Only one torpedo struck home, hitting Taiho forward of the island structure and causing relatively minor visible damage. Japanese damage control officers assessed the hit as superficial, unaware that the torpedo had ruptured aviation fuel tanks deep within the carrier's hull, filling compartments with explosive vapor. For 6 hours, Taiho steamed normally while fuel vapor spread throughout her interior spaces, until a single spark from a generator ignited the accumulated gases in an explosion that blew out the carrier's sides and lifted her armored flight deck like a piece of cardboard. November 14, 1944, the submarine training facility at Pearl Harbor had evolved into what submariners informally called Convoy College, a school where newly arrived submarine commanders learned hard-won tactical lessons from veterans who had survived multiple war patrols. Commander Richard O'Kane, recently promoted and awarded the Medal of Honor for his exploits commanding USS Tang, stood before a classroom of submarine officers and detailed the tactics that made his boat the most successful American submarine in terms of tonnage sunk. O'Kane emphasized aggressive surface night attacks, using radar for targeting while remaining invisible to enemy lookouts in the darkness. His tactics had accounted for 24 Japanese ships sunk during Tang's first 4 patrols, but his 5th patrol ended in disaster when one of his own torpedoes malfunctioned and circled back to sink Tang, leaving O'Kane and 8 other survivors to endure Japanese prisoner-of-war camps until war's end. The lessons taught at Convoy College reflected the accumulated wisdom purchased with American lives during 3 years of submarine warfare. Instructors drilled new commanders on the proper tactics for penetrating destroyer screens, how to use ocean thermal layers to hide from sonar, when to use electric torpedoes versus steam torpedoes, and most importantly, how to maintain aggressive spirit while avoiding unnecessary risks. The curriculum included detailed analysis of Japanese anti-submarine tactics, which had grown increasingly sophisticated as the war progressed. Japanese convoy escorts now employed coordinated depth charge patterns, used aircraft for submarine reconnaissance, and developed new sonar equipment that could detect submarines at greater ranges than early war systems. Japanese Naval Staff Officer Commander Tetsuo Tsukudo compiled reports at Combined Fleet headquarters in Tokyo during late 1944 that painted a grim picture of the submarine war's impact on Japan's economy. Merchant ship losses exceeded new construction by ratios of 3-to-1, meaning Japan's merchant fleet shrank every month despite maximum shipyard production. The statistics Tsukudo presented showed American submarines had sunk more than 4 million tons of Japanese merchant shipping during 1944 alone, strangling the flow of raw materials from conquered territories to Japanese factories. Oil tankers represented particularly critical losses, as Japan's entire war-making capacity depended on petroleum imports from the Dutch East Indies that now had to run a gauntlet of submarines stretching from Singapore to the home islands. Commander Eugene Fluckey took USS Barb into the East China Sea during January 1945 for a patrol that would become legendary among submarine veterans. Fluckey exemplified the aggressive spirit that characterized American submarine commanders by 1945, willing to take calculated risks that earlier commanders would have considered suicidal. He brought Barb into shallow coastal waters where Japanese assumed submarines could not operate, attacking anchored shipping in harbors and even conducting a surface gun raid against a coastal town. On January 23, Fluckey executed a daring penetration of Namquan Harbor on China's coast, navigating through mine waters in darkness to attack a convoy of 30 Japanese ships anchored in the supposedly protected harbor. Fluckey's attack on Namquan Harbor demonstrated how completely American submarines had achieved dominance over Japanese merchant shipping by the war's final months. He fired his entire load of torpedoes in a single devastating salvo, sinking or damaging 15 Japanese vessels in less than 30 minutes before withdrawing through the harbor entrance while Japanese shore batteries fired blindly into the darkness. The Japanese merchant marine had been reduced to cowering in harbors and shallow waters where submarines theoretically could not reach them, but American commanders like Fluckey proved no harbor was truly safe. According to Fluckey's own memoir published as Thunder Below, the Nanquan Harbor attack represented the culmination of tactical evolution that began with the disastrous torpedo failures of 1942. Japanese merchant marine casualties reflected the submarine campaign's brutal effectiveness. By early 1945, Japan had lost approximately 60% of all merchant seamen who served during the war, killed when submarines sank their ships faster than lifeboats could be launched. Tanker crews suffered even higher casualty rates, as petroleum cargoes ensured that torpedoed tankers erupted in massive fireballs that gave their crews no chance of survival. The psychological impact on surviving merchant seamen was devastating. Ships sailed understaffed as sailors refused to embark on what they correctly perceived as suicide missions. Japan's vital merchant fleet, which began the war with approximately 6 million tons of shipping, had been reduced to less than 2 million tons of operational vessels, most of those damaged or in need of repair. The strangulation of Japanese maritime commerce achieved exactly what American war planners had predicted before Pearl Harbor. It crippled Japan's ability to sustain modern warfare. June 9, 1945, 9 American submarines slipped through the Tsushima Strait in darkness, entering the Sea of Japan through waters the Japanese had considered absolutely secure throughout the war. The operation, codenamed Barney, represented the ultimate expression of American submarine dominance in the Pacific. The Sea of Japan had remained a sanctuary for Japanese shipping because the narrow straits connecting it to the Pacific Ocean were heavily mined and patrolled, making submarine penetration theoretically impossible. But by mid-1945, American submarines carried EFM sonar equipment that could detect mines underwater, allowing skilled commanders to navigate through minefields that would have destroyed earlier submarines. Commander Earl Heidman aboard USS Sea Dog led the penetration, his sonar operator calling out mine positions as the submarine crept through the Tsushima Strait at dead slow speed. The 9 submarines of Operation Barney included some of the Pacific Fleet's most experienced boats and commanders. USS Crevalle, USS Spadefish, USS Tenosa, USS Bonefish, USS Tunny, USS Skate, USS Flying Fish, and USS Bowfin followed Sea Dog through the minefields and dispersed throughout the Sea of Japan with orders to destroy every Japanese ship they encountered. Japanese shipping in these waters had grown complacent, convinced that American submarines could not penetrate the mine straits. Merchant vessels sailed without escorts, lights burning at night, following predictable routes between Korean ports and the Japanese home islands. For the submarine commanders prowling the Sea of Japan, it was like hunting in a barrel stocked with targets that had no idea predators had entered their sanctuary. Commander Lawrence Edge aboard USS Bonefish attacked a large passenger liner converted to troop transport on June 18th, firing a spread of 4 torpedoes from 2,500 yards range. The transport, carrying reinforcements destined for Japanese forces in Korea, took 3 hits and sank in less than 10 minutes. Edge counted over 2,000 soldiers in the water as Bonefish withdrew from the area, a grim harvest that illustrated how completely the submarine campaign had evolved beyond targeting just merchant cargo vessels. By June 1945, American submarines were sinking anything Japanese that floated, from major warships to tiny coastal freighters, systematically eliminating Japan's ability to move men and materials by sea. The rules of engagement in the Sea of Japan were simple. Sink everything. Spare nothing. Japanese Rear Admiral Takajiro Onishi received reports at his Maizuru Naval District headquarters that should have been impossible. Multiple merchant ships had been torpedoed in the Sea of Japan over the past week, attacks that could only come from submarines that somehow penetrated the Tsushima Strait minefields. Onishi ordered emergency anti-submarine patrols and deployed additional mine barriers. But the American submarines remained invisible and untouchable, striking at will before disappearing into the depths. The Japanese naval staff in Tokyo initially refused to believe submarines were operating in the Sea of Japan, assuming the sinkings resulted from mines breaking loose from their moorings or perhaps sabotage by Korean resistance fighters. Reality slowly forced itself upon them as the attacks continued and survivors reported seeing periscopes and torpedo wakes. Operation Barney submarines sank 28 Japanese ships totaling over 50,000 tons during their 17-day rampage through the Sea of Japan, and the psychological impact exceeded even these substantial material losses. Japanese planners had considered the Sea of Japan their last secure shipping route, protected by geography and minefields from American interdiction. The successful submarine penetration demonstrated that nowhere remained safe for Japanese merchant shipping.